Let me fix it for you. A homeless beggar hears Billionaire's cry and taught him what he failed. Somebody help me, please. The cry didn't come from a beggar in the street. It came from the top floor of a skyscraper in Victoria Island, from the lips of billionaire Richard Lawson, a man the world thought was unshakable. Inside the glass-walled boardroom, silence pressed down like a weight. The hum of the air conditioner was the only sound, filling the gaps that his engineers could not. Richard, Nigeria's aerospace giant, a man who once dined with presidents and signed billion-dollar contracts with a single stroke of his pen, now clutched the table like a drowning man clings to driftwood. His knuckles were white, his voice raw. "We have 48 hours, he whispered again, slower this time, each word breaking under the weight of despair. "If we don't fix this flight system, the airlines walk away. The contracts vanish. And the next plane that takes off could fall out of the sky." Every engineer in the room lowered their eyes. Weeks of failed equations covered the whiteboard. Lines colliding, arrows stabbing, numbers that refused to agree. The room smelled of coffee gone cold and sweat of defeat. Nobody dared speak. Nobody had the answer. For a man like Richard, silence was worse than betrayal. His chest heaved. He buried his face into his palms. Billionaire, yes. Powerful, yes. But right now, he was just a man broken by fear. And yet, just beyond that glass door, stood someone no one expected. David Okafor. His beard was rough, his coat frayed at the edges, his feet bare against the polished floor. He looked like he belonged under a bridge, not near a boardroom. Clutched tightly to his chest was a brown, battered bag, his only possession in the world. But his eyes, they were sharp, alive, locked on the chaos of equations inside that room. To everyone else, the whiteboard looked like failure. To him, it was a puzzle whispering its secret. Richard's words echoed again, breaking the silence. Why can't we get it right? Why are we failing? And that was the moment David moved. The glass door creaked open. Gasps filled the boardroom. Engineers recoiled, disgust flashing across their faces. A beggar? Here. At a time like this? The guards stepped forward, muscles tense, ready to throw him out. But before they could, David lifted his chin. His voice, low and steady, cut through the air sharper than any command. "Let me fix it for you." The entire room froze. The engineers stared in disbelief. The guards hesitated. And Richard? Richard slowly lifted his head, his tear-streaked eyes narrowing at the ragged stranger who dared to speak. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. Then Richard leaned back in his chair, still staring, as though trying to decide whether he was hearing madness, or a miracle. Before his voice shocked the boardroom, before the guards froze at his words, David Okafor's morning had started like every other morning, under the cold belly of the Echo Bridge. The first rays of Lagos sun cut through the cracks in the concrete, painting his world in slanted gold. The city above was already stirring, horns honked, danfos coughed black smoke into the air, hawkers shouted, "Pure water," like bells calling the day awake. Down here, the world was different. Damp. Lonely. Forgotten. David sat up slowly from the piece of cardboard he called his bed. His tattered coat clung to his shoulders as he reached for the brown, battered bag that never left his side. He held it against his chest the way a man clutches a child. Inside that bag were the only 3 pieces of proof that he had once lived another life. A worn-out aeronautical engineering textbook, its corners eaten by time. A bundle of old certificates, now faded but once stamped with honor. A single pen, half its ink gone, the other half still stubbornly alive. He pressed the book to his heart and closed his eyes. For a moment, he could almost hear the roar of jet engines again, smell the crisp air of laboratories, feel the weight of respect that once came with his name. But the memory faded. All that remained was the rust-stained concrete above him and the sound of water dripping from the bridge's cracks. David dragged himself to the public tap nearby. The water was cold, metallic, biting against his skin. He cupped it in his hands and splashed his face, watching the ripples in the puddle beneath him form a reflection he barely recognized. The beard. The tangled hair. The weary eyes. He tried to smile, but the smile didn't stay long. Still, something inside him stirred as he stepped into the bustling flow of the city. The crowd of workers in crisp shirts and polished shoes surged past him, barely noticing the beggar in their midst. But David wasn't really looking at them. His eyes locked, as they always did, on one building that towered over Victoria Island like a silver giant. Lawson Aerospace. The letters gleamed in the sun, and every time David walked past, it felt like torture. Like a starving man walking past a bakery with its doors open but forbidden to enter. Today, however, was different. The air around the building buzzed with urgency. Staff hurried inside with laptops tucked under their arms. News crews lingered outside. There was fear in their steps, tension in their voices. David slowed his pace. His chest tightened. Through the glass of the lobby, he could see screens flashing red, engineers whispering, guards pacing. His instincts, those old instincts that had never died, woke up inside him. Something was wrong. Something he knew he could fix. He tightened his grip on the brown bag. His footsteps carried him not past the building this time, but toward its open door. Not sneaky. Not desperate. Just steady. The way a man walks when he feels destiny pulling him. And that was how, minutes later, a beggar from under the bridge found himself standing in front of the Lawson Aerospace boardroom, on the edge of rewriting his fate. The Lawson Aerospace boardroom was a storm of silence. Richard Lawson still sat slumped at the head of the table, his hand pressed against his forehead, his voice echoing in everyone's ears, "If we don't fix this, planes will fall out of the sky." His engineers fidgeted, scribbling nonsense on notepads, some glancing at their screens just to avoid his eyes. No one dared speak. The weight of failure was too heavy. That was when the glass door creaked. Every head snapped toward it. Standing there was a figure who did not belong, a man in a torn coat, hair tangled, beard untrimmed, clutching a brown bag so tight his knuckles looked carved from stone. His feet were bare against the polished marble floor. Dust clung to him like a second skin. Gasps rippled around the table. A junior engineer whispered under his breath, "Who let a beggar up here?" Two security guards instantly moved, their steps heavy, their hands already reaching. To them, he was nothing but a nuisance that needed to be thrown out of the billionaire's sight. But before they could seize him, the man lifted his head. His eyes, sharp and unshaken, swept over the chaotic whiteboard full of broken arrows and equations. He didn't blink. He didn't flinch. And then his voice came. Low. Steady. Certain. "Let me fix it for you." The words froze the entire boardroom. The guards stopped mid-step, their hands still in the air. Engineers exchanged baffled looks. Was this man mad? A street beggar claiming he could solve what the best minds in the country had failed for weeks? Richard Lawson slowly raised his head. His eyes, still damp from the weight of his own despair, locked onto the ragged stranger. For a long moment, the billionaire said nothing. He simply studied him. His torn coat, his dust-caked shoes, the battered bag in his arms. The room erupted in murmurs. "This is insane. Security, throw him out. What can he possibly know?" But Richard's hand lifted weakly, halting the guards. Something in the man's eyes held him. They weren't the eyes of a madman. They were the eyes of someone who understood. Richard's voice, hoarse but firm, broke the tension. "What did you just say?" The man straightened his back. He tightened his grip on the bag. His voice didn't shake. "I said, let me fix it for you." A stunned silence followed. Even the hum of the air conditioner seemed to pause, as if the building itself was listening. Richard leaned back in his chair. His lips pressed into a thin line, his eyes narrowing with a mix of disbelief and fragile hope. For a heartbeat, the future of an empire, and perhaps the lives of countless passengers, hung on whether a billionaire would take a chance on a beggar. For a long moment, no one moved. The engineers sat stiff in their seats, glancing nervously at Richard Lawson, waiting for him to erupt. Security guards hovered like shadows, ready to drag the intruder away. But Richard didn't shout. He didn't wave his hand to dismiss the ragged stranger. He simply stared at him. "What makes you think," Richard said slowly, his voice edged with exhaustion, "that you can see what my best engineers cannot?" The man shifted the brown bag tighter against his chest. His face, lined with dust and weariness, remained calm. His answer was simple. "Because I've been where you are. And I've been where that board is. Lost in numbers that scream louder than sense. I can see the mistake." The engineers scoffed. One of them, a young man in a fitted suit, leaned forward. "This is madness, sir. We've spent weeks on this system. He's a nobody." Another engineer whispered bitterly, "Throw him out before he embarrasses us." But Richard's eyes narrowed further. His hand slid across the polished table until his fingers touched a marker lying abandoned by the whiteboard. He picked it up, rolled it once in his palm, and then, unexpectedly, slid it across the table toward the beggar. "If you waste our time," Richard said softly, his voice hoarse but sharp, "you waste my company. Don't waste it." Gasps filled the room. The engineers couldn't believe it. Their billionaire was handing a beggar the fate of the company. David Okafor stepped forward. His bare feet made no sound on the cold floor. The smell of dust and sweat followed him, making a few people wrinkle their noses. But when he reached the whiteboard, everything else seemed to fall away. He stood still for 3 long seconds, marker in hand, staring at the chaos of lines and arrows like a man staring into the soul of an old enemy. Then, without clearing his throat, without hesitation, he moved. First, he wiped away 2 arrows that fought each other across the diagram of the plane's wing. He replaced them with one clean line, smooth, deliberate, like a river that had always been there, waiting to be seen. Next, he circled a small box labeled AOA and wrote beside it, in bold strokes. "Sensor drift under vibration." Murmurs rippled around the table. Then, in quick motions, he added 3 short equations, not too many, just enough. Beneath them, he wrote in large, certain letters. "Feedback loop overreacts." Finally, with a flick of his wrist, he drew a tiny smiley face near the tail of the aircraft. Not as a joke, but as if to say, "Here. Here's where the plane wants peace." "What are you saying?" one engineer asked sharply. David turned, his voice steady, his words clear. "When the plane feels small shakes, this sensor panics. It thinks the nose is too high. It forces the system to push down too hard. The pilots fight back. The plane and the pilot wrestle each other until they fall." He tapped the board again. "The solution is simple. We slow the panic. We filter the noise. And we let the pilot's hands speak sooner. Silence. But not the silence of disbelief. The silence of realization." The engineers leaned forward. Even the guards forgot themselves, staring at the board. And Richard Lawson, his weary eyes, for the first time in weeks, glimmered with something dangerously close to hope. The boardroom had changed. Just moments ago, it was a tomb of silence and despair. Now it pulsed with a strange energy. Engineers who had slumped in defeat were sitting upright, their eyes locked on the ragged man at the whiteboard. David Okafor stepped back, dropping the marker into the tray as though the board itself could speak now. The equations and sketches, so simple, so human, hung in the air like a new language only he could write. Richard Lawson rose from his chair. His gaze lingered on the whiteboard, then shifted back to David. "You," Richard said quietly, "what's your name?" David hesitated, then answered. David Okafor. The name rolled across the room, unfamiliar, almost too ordinary. But no one missed the way he carried it, with the quiet dignity of a man who had nothing left to prove. Build it, Richard commanded suddenly. His voice was no longer weak, it was sharp, alive. Run the simulation. Now. Chairs screeched back. Laptops opened. Fingers flew across keyboards. Engineers who just minutes ago were ready to throw David out now scrambled to translate his simple instructions into code. The projector lit up, flooding the glass walls with the gray-blue glow of a digital sky. On the screen, a model of the aircraft sat poised at the end of a virtual runway. Its engines hummed in silence. Numbers blinked at the edges, waiting. One of the senior engineers, a woman with tired eyes but a sharp mind, glanced at Richard. We'll test the roughest case, she warned. The one that broke every solution we tried. Richard nodded firmly. Do it. The room grew still. 3, the engineer counted. 2. 1. The simulation roared to life. The plane on the screen accelerated, lifted, and met the wind. Instantly, turbulence struck, violent, relentless. The numbers spiked red. Alarms blinked. Everyone in that room knew what should come next. The autopilot would panic. The nose would dive. The pilots would fight. Disaster. David leaned forward slightly. His lips parted, whispering, not as a prayer, not as a boast, but as a coach to a player about to take the field. Soft hands. The boardroom held its breath. On the screen, the filter caught the wild shakes. The helpers cross-checked. The heartbeat ticked steady. The plane's nose dipped, but only a little. For the first time, the system didn't fight the pilot. It yielded, like a proud fighter learning to listen. The graph that always spiked into chaos now curved, smooth, controlled, calm. Richard's fingers dug into the back of his chair. Sweat beaded on his forehead. He couldn't breathe. And then, just as the final line began to crawl into the green zone, the power flickered. The projector went black. Gasps exploded. Engineers cursed under their breath. For 2 long heartbeats, there was nothing, no numbers, no sky, no proof. Only silence. Richard turned sharply toward David, his voice a whisper of desperation. Did it work? The entire room leaned forward, waiting for the answer from the beggar who had dared to promise salvation. The boardroom felt like a coffin. The projector was dead, the numbers gone, hope snuffed out in an instant. Engineers sat frozen, their eyes darting between the blank screen and the ragged stranger still standing at the whiteboard. Then, beep. The UPS kicked in. The projector flickered back to life with a gray sigh, dragging the digital sky back onto the wall. For a heartbeat, the screen held its breath. Then, in bold green letters, the final box appeared. Success. The room erupted. Some gasped and covered their mouths. Others leapt to their feet, clapping and cheering. A junior engineer actually cried. Weeks of despair had just been broken by a man they had almost thrown out. Richard Lawson didn't move. He just stared at the screen, lips trembling, until the truth sank in. Then he turned sharply toward David Okafor, eyes wide and wet. It worked, he whispered. His voice cracked. My God, it actually worked. David dropped the marker gently onto the tray. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the flood of memories crashing back. Years since anyone had listened. Years since his mind had mattered. And now, standing in rags, he had saved them all. Richard moved without thinking. He crossed the room, gripped David's shoulders, and pulled him into a rough embrace. Thank you, Richard choked out. You just saved my company. And maybe lives we'll never even know about. The guards by the door shifted awkwardly, realizing this wasn't a trespasser. This was the key. Minutes later, David sat in a leather chair in Richard's office. It felt strange beneath him, soft, warm, too clean. His brown bag rested by his side, untouched. He clutched it still, like a man clutching his soul. Richard paced the floor, his mind racing. He stopped suddenly, turning to face him. "You walked into my boardroom from the street," Richard said, still trying to believe it. "Who are you? How did you know the one thing my best engineers could not?" David lowered his eyes to the floor. Silence stretched. His throat worked as though the words were heavy. Then, slowly, he reached into his battered bag. From it, he pulled a book. Old. Faded. Its pages yellowed with age, its cover cracked from years of use. An aeronautical engineering textbook. He placed it gently on Richard's desk. "This," David said softly, his voice shaking, "is what reminds me of who I used to be." Richard sat down across from him, leaning forward, his eyes burning with curiosity. "Tell me." David drew in a long, ragged breath. "My name is David Okafor," he began. "Once, I was a top aeronautical engineer. I worked in the United States for 10 years. I designed systems, solved problems, lived in the sky. I had a family, my wife, Clara, and 2 boys, Daniel and Joseph. I thought I was blessed." His eyes clouded, his voice cracked. "But betrayal came. I doubted my wife. I made the mistake of running DNA tests on my children. The results said, they weren't mine." Richard stiffened in his chair. "The morning after," David continued bitterly, "the police stopped me on my way to work. They searched my briefcase and found drugs inside. Not mine. Planted. I was arrested. Charged. Jailed for 2 years. By the time I came out, I had lost my career, my reputation, my family. My wife destroyed me. And after deportation, I returned to Nigeria with nothing." He swallowed hard. His hand patted the brown bag gently. "I've been living under the bridge ever since. But this bag. With my book and my certificates, it's all I've had to remind me that once, I mattered." Richard's throat tightened. For a long moment, he couldn't speak. His empire, his millions, his pride, all of it felt small compared to the ruin in front of him. Finally, Richard said quietly, almost reverently. "Genius can be buried, but it never dies." The next morning, the doors of Lawson Aerospace opened to a sight no one expected. The ragged beggar who had walked in barefoot, clutching a brown bag, now returned in a sharp navy blue suit that fit him like it had been waiting all his life. His beard was neatly trimmed, his hair brushed clean. He stood taller, his shoulders squared, his eyes calm but fierce. It was David Okafor, but not the man who had walked in yesterday. This was the man who had been buried for years under bridges and betrayal. Richard Lawson had made sure of it. After their long talk in the office, Richard had refused to let him go back under the bridge. He sent his driver to take David first to a barber shop, then to a boutique, then to a hotel where he was given hot food and a soft bed. For the first time in years, David saw his reflection in a full-length mirror and didn't see a ghost staring back. He saw a man being reborn. When he stepped into the boardroom that morning, silence fell. The same engineers who had wrinkled their noses at him yesterday now stared in shock. The air was thick with awe, and something else, envy. Richard walked in behind him, his voice carrying authority. "Ladies and gentlemen," he declared, "this man saved Lawson Aerospace yesterday. Without him, we would have lost everything. His name is David Okafor. And from today, he is not just part of this company, he is your new lead engineer." Applause broke out, scattered at first, then building. Some clapped genuinely, impressed by the brilliance they had seen. Others forced it, their eyes cold even as their palms met. Among the latter was Obinna Nwosu, the man David had unknowingly replaced. Obinna had been Lawson Aerospace's golden boy, the lead engineer Richard once trusted most. He was young, ambitious, and proud. But yesterday, in the space of a few minutes, all of that had been stripped from him by a man who had come in from the streets. Obinna's jaw tightened as he clapped, his smile thin and brittle. Inside, his pride burned. How could Richard trust this man over me? I built this company. I earned my place. And now a beggar takes my seat. David, unaware of the storm forming across the room, bowed his head humbly. I am grateful for the chance, he said quietly. All I ask is that we work together, with open minds, with patience, with respect. Greatness isn't in pride. It's in listening. His words only fueled the bitterness in Obinna's chest. Pride was all Obinna had ever known. After the meeting, engineers crowded David, shaking his hand, asking questions. Some whispered, "Mentor," under their breath. For the first time since his fall, David felt the warmth of respect. But at the back of the room, arms folded, eyes burning, Obinna Nwosu watched. Every clap, every smile given to David was like a dagger driven deeper into his pride. And quietly, deep in the shadows of his heart, Obinna swore. This man doesn't belong here. I will make sure he falls. The weeks that followed were unlike anything David Okafor had lived in years. Each day he stepped into Lawson Aerospace, not as the beggar clinging to a battered bag, but as the lead engineer whose ideas had saved the company. The respect of the younger engineers surprised him most. They hovered around him after meetings, listening as he broke down complex systems in words so simple they almost felt like proverbs. But in the midst of calculations and boardroom strategies, someone else began to notice him, someone who saw beyond the brilliance and into the man himself. Her name was Juliana Peters. She wasn't an engineer but an accountant. She had a quiet presence, always walking through the halls with neat files pressed against her chest and a calm smile that carried more kindness than most people dared to show in a corporate tower. While others gossiped about the beggar-turned-engineer, Juliana watched quietly, studying David's humility. Their first exchange was brief, just a polite, "Good morning," at the elevator. David nodded, awkward, still not used to the new suit Richard had given him. Juliana noticed the way he adjusted his cuff as though the clothes belonged to someone else. She smiled, not out of mockery, but with a warmth that said, "I see you." Over time, their paths crossed more often. Late evenings when most employees had left, Juliana would pass by the engineering floor and see David still bent over diagrams, his brown bag always by his side. One evening, she paused, then quietly placed a cup of tea on his desk. "You've been here for hours," she said softly. "You'll burn out if you don't stop." David looked up, startled. No one had ever brought him anything in years. His throat tightened. "Thank you," he said, his voice low. I don't remember the last time someone thought to do that." Juliana tilted her head, her eyes kind. "Maybe you've forgotten, but you deserve it." From that night, something unspoken began between them. They found themselves talking, at first about small things, then bigger ones. She shared stories of her childhood in Port Harcourt, of her love for books and numbers. He shared fragments of his past, careful, hesitant, as though each memory was a shard of glass. Juliana listened without judgment. When he admitted how he once slept under the Echo Bridge, her eyes didn't widen in pity. Instead, she whispered, "And yet, you rose from it. That takes strength." For David, those words carried more power than applause in the boardroom. One evening, as they left the office together, Juliana laughed at something he said. The sound caught him off guard, light, genuine, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. For a moment, David forgot the betrayals, the prison walls, the cold nights under concrete. He only heard her laughter. And though neither of them said it aloud, something new had taken root that night. A seed. A seed of love that would grow quietly, even as shadows gathered elsewhere. Because while David discovered light again, Obinanwosu's envy was hardening into something darker, something dangerous. Obinanwosu sat alone in his office long after the others had left, the glow of the city spilling faintly through the blinds. His desk was scattered with blueprints, not of aircraft, but of the life he believed had been stolen from him. Every headline praising Lawson Aerospace for its miraculous comeback, every whisper in the halls about David Okafor the genius, cut into him like glass. Once, it was Obina's name Richard Lawson called first. Once, he was the star. Now, he was an afterthought, a shadow in a room where David shone too brightly. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, his jaw tight. "He doesn't belong here," he muttered. "He's nothing. A beggar. And yet they treat him like he's a god." The anger twisted deeper. It wasn't just envy. It was humiliation. And humiliation, he knew, demanded payback. Days passed, and Obina's hatred grew sharper. He watched from the back of boardrooms as David stood beside Richard, calmly leading discussions. He overheard the junior engineers whisper mentor when David spoke. He even caught Juliana looking at David with a softness that made his stomach knot. It was unbearable. One night, unable to contain it anymore, Obina left the corporate towers and crossed into the darker corners of Lagos, into a dimly lit bar on the mainland where men with scars and hungry eyes waited for business. At a corner table sat a man they called Django, a thug with a scar running from his left eyebrow to his jaw, his hands heavy with rings that gleamed like warning signs. Django was the kind of man who could make problems disappear, for a price. Obina slid into the chair opposite him, his fitted suit a stark contrast to the gangster's rough shirt. Django's lips curled into a lazy grin. "You look like a man who's lost something important," he said. "Or someone." Obina's eyes burned. "I want him gone." "Gone?" Django raised a brow. "As in, gone forever?" Obina's voice was low, firm. "He humiliated me. Stole my position. My respect. My life. I want him broken. I want him to feel what it's like to lose everything." Django leaned back, amused. "For the right price, we can make that happen." Obina reached into his briefcase and slid an envelope across the table. Thick. Heavy. Django lifted it, thumbed through the bundles of naira stacked inside, and whistled. "It will be done," Django said, his grin spreading. "Consider it handled." Obina stood, his pulse steady for the first time in weeks. As he walked out of the bar into the thick Lagos night, a dangerous calm settled over him. Tomorrow, the world would still call David Okafor a savior. But Obina knew something they didn't. The beggar-turned-engineer's story was about to be cut short. And Obina would be the one holding the knife. The night before his wedding, David Okafor sat alone in the living room of the mansion Richard Lawson had gifted him. The house was silent, the chandeliers glowing softly above, their light dancing across polished marble floors. On the table before him lay his old engineering textbook, open to a page he had once memorized in another life. He traced the faded lines with his finger, a small smile tugging at his lips. Tomorrow, he would marry Juliana Peters. Tomorrow, the man who once slept under a bridge would stand tall in a suit and vow to love a woman who had seen him at his lowest and chosen him still. For the first time in years, peace felt possible. Then came the knock. Sharp. Sudden. Too late for visitors. David frowned, rising from his chair. He crossed the living room and pulled open the massive front door. 3 men stood there. Jackets dark, eyes harder. Before he could speak, one of them raised a gun. The shot cracked through the night, echoing across Banana Island like thunder. Fire tore through David's arm. He gasped, stumbling back as blood soaked his sleeve. "David," a guard shouted from outside. Chaos erupted. The attackers bolted, firing into the air to scatter security before vanishing into the shadows. David collapsed onto the floor, clutching his wound, his vision blurring. Pain swallowed him, but deeper than the pain was the terror of losing everything again. Not now. Not when he had just begun to live again. His last thought before darkness claimed him was Juliana's face, and the word tomorrow. The sirens wailed through the night, racing him to Lagos University Teaching Hospital. Doctors fought for hours. Juliana refused to leave his side, her hands clinging to his as she whispered desperate prayers through tears. Richard Lawson paced the corridor, guilt written across his face. "I should have protected him better," Richard muttered. "I brought him into my world, and now they want him dead." For 3 days, David lay unconscious. Machines kept his body alive, but to Juliana, each beep of the monitor felt like a plea she couldn't answer. She laid her head on his chest, whispering, "Don't leave me. Not now. Please." On the third night, his fingers twitched. His chest heaved a ragged cough. Slowly, painfully, David's eyes fluttered open. "David!" Juliana cried, clutching him. Relief flooded her face. Richard rushed in, tears in his eyes. "My brother," he said, gripping David's good hand. "You scared us all. But you're not leaving yet. Not when the world still needs you." David gave a weak smile, but his eyes hardened. "Whoever did this, they won't stop." A week later, Richard ordered a full review of the mansion's CCTV footage. Frame by frame, the truth emerged. The attackers. The meeting at the gates before the shooting. And then, Obinna Nwosu. There he was, speaking with Django's men, handing them instructions. Richard's face went pale with rage. "Obinna, how could you?" The police moved swiftly. Django was caught, his gang cornered. Under interrogation, they confessed, Obinna had hired them. Money. Revenge. Pride. The trial was swift but brutal. The federal high court was packed with reporters. On one side sat David, still bandaged but alive, Juliana beside him. On the other, Obinna, dressed in a dark suit, his face defiant. Witnesses testified. Guards. Engineers. Finally Django himself, who admitted, "Yes, Obinna paid us. He wanted Okafor finished." The evidence was undeniable. The judge's voice cut through the courtroom like steel. "Obinna Nwosu, this court finds you guilty of attempted murder and criminal conspiracy. You are hereby sentenced to 20 years imprisonment." Gasps rippled across the room. But as officers dragged him away in chains, Obinna twisted his head toward David and Richard, his voice venom. "This isn't over," he snarled. "Mark my words, I'll come back for you both. I'll destroy everything you've built." The room erupted in noise, but David sat steady, his voice calm, his eyes locked on his enemy. "You've already destroyed yourself." Obinna spat on the floor as the officers forced him out. His threats echoed behind him like a storm retreating, but the shadow of his rage lingered. The morning sun rose over Lagos, painting the lagoon in strokes of gold. The city buzzed awake with horns, shouts, and hawkers, but inside the mansion on Banana Island, the world felt hushed, sacred. David Okafor stood before the mirror in his bedroom, adjusting the lapel of his crisp black suit. His arms still carried scars from the bullet, the bandage hidden beneath his sleeve, but his reflection looked strong, steady, alive. Gone was the man who once woke under the Echo Bridge, clutching a battered bag. In his place stood a man restored. A man about to marry the woman who had seen past his scars. David. He turned. At the doorway stood Richard Lawson, dressed immaculately, his eyes damp but proud. He placed a firm hand on David's shoulder. "You deserve this," Richard said softly. "After everything, today is yours. And if your parents were here, if your boys were here, I know they would be proud too." David swallowed hard, emotion thick in his chest. "You gave me back my life, Richard. Today, I start living it again. The church on Victoria Island overflowed. Engineers, business leaders, even government officials filled the pews, eager to witness the wedding of the man who had not only saved Nigeria's skies but had captured the nation's heart. Cameras flashed, catching every moment. Then the doors opened. Juliana Peters stepped into the aisle, her gown a river of white, her veil shimmering in the light. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the organ swelled. David's breath caught. His heart pounded. He had faced storms, betrayals, even death, but nothing shook him like the sight of Juliana walking toward him, every step a promise. When she reached him, all the noise melted away. The pastor's voice rose, "Do you, David Okafor, take this woman?" "I do," David whispered, his voice breaking. "And do you, Juliana Peters?" "I do," she said, her eyes glistening. "You may kiss the bride." Their lips met, and the church erupted. Applause thundered. Guests rose to their feet, clapping, cheering, some even wiping tears from their eyes. Richard Lawson stood, his hands raised like a man celebrating victory, not just for the company, but for life itself. The reception glowed with laughter, music, and joy. Engineers danced. Business partners toasted. David and Juliana sat at the center, their hands entwined, their eyes never straying from each other. At one point, David leaned close to her ear. "Once, I thought my story ended under a bridge," he whispered. "But God had other plans. He brought me here, to you." Juliana's eyes shone with tears. "And I will never let you go back there." For one night, all shadows seemed gone. The music, the laughter, the love, it all wrapped around David like armor. He was no longer invisible, no longer forgotten. He was a husband, a leader, a man reborn. But as the night waned and the stars stretched above Lagos, Richard's words echoed in the back of David's mind. Obinna's threats are not finished. And David knew, though this chapter was filled with joy, the shadows of envy had a way of waiting. Months passed, and peace seemed to settle over David Okafor's life like a long-awaited dawn. Lawson Aerospace thrived under his leadership, contracts were renewed, safety systems praised, and the name Okafor whispered with admiration across the aviation industry. Newspapers called him the beggar who saved the skies. But for David, his greatest pride wasn't in headlines or boardrooms. It was in the soft, steady breaths of his newborn son. The mansion on Banana Island no longer echoed with loneliness. It now rang with Juliana's laughter and the gentle cries of baby Clinton Okafor, wrapped in soft blue cloth. At night, David would sit on the balcony, cradling the tiny boy against his chest, staring out at the city lights. "You will never know the life I lived under the bridge," he whispered to his son. "You will only know love. You will only know safety." Juliana leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. "He already has everything he needs," she said softly. "You." David kissed her forehead. For a while, the world felt whole. But shadows, no matter how small, never vanish completely. One evening, Richard Lawson arrived at the mansion with a heavy look on his face. They sat in the study, the sound of Clinton's baby laughter echoing faintly from upstairs. "We've received word from inside the prison," Richard said gravely. "Obinna is talking. He claims he still has connections on the outside. Men who owe him favors. He says, even behind bars, he can reach you." David frowned, his hand tightening on the armrest. "He's locked away. What more can he do?" Richard leaned forward. "He's dangerous, David. And desperate men always find desperate ways. Don't underestimate him." David nodded slowly. But when Richard left that night, he walked upstairs to Clinton's room. He watched his son sleeping peacefully, Juliana curled beside the crib. His heart tightened. He remembered the gunshot. The pain. Juliana's tears. The shadows that had nearly stolen everything. He touched the crib rail and whispered fiercely. If Obinna comes again, he will fail. I swear it. Meanwhile, in the cold yard of Kirikiri prison, Obinna Nwosu stood by the chain-link fence, his eyes burning with the same venom that had carried him into ruin. Inmates whispered about him, about his promises, his rage, his plans. As guards led him back to his cell, he leaned close to another prisoner and muttered. Tell them. Tell my men. I am not finished. Lawson thinks he's safe. Okafor thinks he's untouchable. But I will come back for them. I will destroy everything they've built. The inmate nodded slowly. And Obinna's lips curled into a thin, dangerous smile. Back on Banana Island, David sat on the balcony with Clinton in his arms, Juliana by his side. The night sky stretched above, calm and full of stars. What are you thinking about? Juliana asked softly. David looked at her, then at their son, then at the city glowing in the distance. I'm thinking about the future, he said quietly. And how the greatest battles are not against enemies outside, but against the ones within, fear, doubt, pain. Those are the enemies I must conquer. For him. For us. Juliana squeezed his hand, her voice firm. And you will. Because you are David Okafor. You always rise. The night grew still, almost too still, as if the world itself held its breath. And though David didn't say it aloud, one truth echoed in his heart. Obinna's war was not over. The shadows had only retreated. And somewhere, waiting, they would rise again. Life buried David Okafor under bridges, betrayal, and chains of poverty. Yet in the moment when a billionaire cried out for help, the man the world ignored was the only one who could save him. His story proves a timeless truth. Genius can be forgotten, but it cannot be destroyed. Hope can be delayed, but it cannot be denied. We all carry scars, failures, and shadows. But just like David, the world may be waiting for the very thing only you can give. Sometimes, the voices dismissed as worthless are the ones destined to rewrite history. So whenever you feel unseen, remember, your lowest point can become the stage for your greatest rise. If this story moved you, don't just leave silently. Drop a comment below. What would you do if the world wrote you off, but destiny gave you one more chance? And tell us, where are you watching from? We love seeing our community from around the world. If you felt the pain, suspense, and triumph in David's journey, smash that like button right now. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another powerful story like this one. Because here, every story is not just entertainment, it's a lesson about life, betrayal, resilience, and redemption. Until next time, remember. The shadows may rise, but those who keep walking always rise higher.